I've been a park ranger in the Appalachian Mountains for going on 16 years now, stationed out of a small outpost in the heart of West Virginia, where the ridges fold into each other like crumpled paper and the fog hangs low most mornings like it's trying to hide something. It's a job that suits me, or at least it used to. Solitude broken only by the occasional hiker or the rustle of wildlife, the kind of quiet that lets a man think without the noise of the world pressing in. But these mountains have a way of wearing on you, especially when the weather turns. The rains come heavy here, not like the gentle showers down in the valleys, but pounding deluges that turn trails into streams and wash away any sense of certainty. I've pulled folks out of mudslides, tracked lost kids through thunderstorms, and even once found a body half buried after a flash flood carried it miles from where it started. You learn to respect the land, to listen to its moods, because out here, ignoring them can cost you everything. Still, nothing in all those years readied me for that night in late October when the storm rolled in like Judgment Day and brought with it something I can't quite explain, something that whispers in the back of my mind even now. It started ordinary enough, as these things often do. The day had been crisp, leaves turning that fiery red and gold that draws the leaf peepers up from the cities, but by afternoon, the sky darkened quicker than usual. Clouds piled up over the peaks, heavy and bruised, and the wind picked up, carrying that metallic tang of coming rain. I was finishing up paperwork in the ranger station, a squat log building with a leaky roof and a radio that crackled more than it spoke, when the call came in. A group of campers down by Laurel Creek had radioed about rising water. Their site was flooding, tents getting swamped, and they needed guidance on evacuating safely. It wasn't unusual. We'd had a wet fall, and the creek swelled fast in these hollows. I grabbed my gear, rain slicker, heavy boots, flashlight with fresh batteries, and my sidearm, just in case, and headed out in the truck. The drive down the gravel access road was already treacherous, tires spinning in the softening mud, wipers slapping furiously against the first fat drops. By the time I reached the trailhead, the storm had fully unleashed, rain hammering the roof like buckshot, thunder rumbling distant but closing in. I parked and stepped out, the cold wet hitting me like a slap. Visibility was poor, maybe 30 feet at best under the truck's headlights, but I knew these paths like the veins on my hands. The campers were about a mile in, along a loop trail that skirted the creek. I radioed base to let them know I was on foot, then shouldered my pack and started down the path. The ground sucked at my boots with every step, water pooling in low spots, and the trees groaned under the wind's assault, branches whipping like they were alive and angry. Leaves plastered themselves to my face, and the air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decaying foliage. I called out periodically, my voice thin against the roar. "Ranger service, anyone out here?" But the storm swallowed it whole. It took longer than it should to reach the campsite. The trail had turned into a shallow river, forcing me to detour through thicker brush where thorns clawed at my pants legs. By the time I spotted the faint glow of 8 lanterns through the sheets of rain, I was soaked through, chilled to the bone despite the layers. The campers were a family of 4, parents and 2 teens, huddled under a tarp they'd strung between trees, their tents half submerged in the overflowing creek. They looked relieved when I emerged from the dark, faces pale in the flashlight beam. The dad shook my hand vigorously, thanking me profusely, while the mom bundled the kids' wet gear. I helped them pack up essentials, guided them back to the trailhead with warnings about slippery spots and fallen limbs. It was straightforward work, the kind that reminds you why you do this, keeping folks safe in a place that doesn't care one way or the other. We made it to their car without incident, and they drove off toward town, tail lights fading into the murk. I should have headed back then, called it a night, but something nagged at me. The creek was higher than I'd seen in years, and there was a chance other sites downstream might be affected. Protocol said to check, so I did. Back on the trail, alone now, the storm seemed louder, more insistent, like it was trying to drive me away. That's when I first heard it. Not the rain's constant drum or the wind's howl, but something underneath, a low, murmuring whisper that cut through the noise like a thread of smoke in clear air. It was faint at first, easy to dismiss as the creek gurgling over rocks or leaves rustling in a peculiar way. I paused, flashlight sweeping the undergrowth, water dripping from my hat brim into my eyes. "Hello? Anyone need help?" I shouted, but the words felt futile, lost immediately. The whispering persisted, growing a touch clearer, rhythmic like a chant or prayer, coming from off the trail to my left, where the words thickened into a tangle of rhododendron and fallen logs. My pulse quickened, not fear, not yet, but that instinctual wariness you develop out here, the same that tells you a bear's nearby or a storm's about to worsen. I radioed base again. "This is Ranger Ellis, checking downstream from Laurel Creek, hearing possible distress sounds, investigating." Static answered, the signal spotty in the weather, but I pressed on. Pushing through the brush was slow going. Thorns snagged my slicker, tearing small rips, and the ground sloped unevenly, forcing me to grab saplings for balance. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, words forming but not quite intelligible. Something about waiting, about water. It reminded me of old hymns my grandma used to hum back in the holler, the kind sung in dimly lit churches where folks spoke of signs and portents. The rain pelted harder, stinging my skin, and my flashlight beam danced erratic shadows across the trees, making everything look alive and shifting. I called out again, closer now, and the murmuring stopped mid-phrase, leaving only the storm symphony. That's when I saw it, a sagging tarp draped between two oaks, makeshift shelter for what looked like a huddled form beneath. Tattered clothes clung to a thin frame, hood pulled low, water cascading off in rivulets. Relief washed over me at first, probably a vagrant or lost soul seeking cover, but it ebbed quick as that. That deep unease settled in, the kind that makes your gut twist without reason. I approached slow, boots squelching in the mud, hand hovering near my radio. "Hey there, you all right? This is Park Service. Storm's bad. Need a hand getting out?" No response, just the figure stillness, unnatural in the whipping wind. Up close, the tarp smelled of mildew and something sharper, like wet rot. The whispering started again, softer now, from under that hood, words tumbling out in a monotone. The old ones, waiting in the water, rising with the rain. My skin prickled. It wasn't English exactly, or not modern, laced with an accent thick as the fog, old-timey like tales from settlers long gone. I knelt a bit, trying to see the face, flashlight angled careful not to blind. "What was that? You hurt? Let's get you to shelter." The figure turned then, deliberate and slow, hood falling back just in the beam's glow. Eyes met mine, wide, unblinking, white stark against shadowed skin, pupils like voids that reflected no light, no spark of life. The face was gaunt, cheeks hollowed like it'd been starving for months, skin pale and veined, but it was the expression that hit hardest, blank curiosity, like I was the oddity here. They muttered again, clearer this time, the old ones waiting in the water, then stood abrupt, taller than I'd guessed, frame unfolding like a broken umbrella. No sound of movement, no splash in the puddles, just up and gone, melting into the rain curtain beyond my light. I lunged forward, beam swinging wild, shouting, "Wait, stop!" But the woods swallowed 'em whole. I searched for what felt like hours, circling the area, pushing deeper into the thicket where branches clawed like fingers. No footprints in the mud, no snapped twigs, no trace at all, despite the soft ground that should have held every step. My radio finally crackled through, base checking in, concerned about the delay. I reported a possible vagrant, evasive, but even saying it felt wrong, like lying to myself. By the time I trudged back to the truck, muscles aching, clothes heavy as lead, the storm was easing to a drizzle, thunder fading eastward. Back at the station, I stripped off the wet gear, brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint, and tried to shake it off. Chalked it up to fatigue, the weather playing tricks on an overworked mind. But sleep didn't come easy that night. Those eyes stared back in the dark, and the whisper echoed in my ears like a record skipping. Come morning, with the sun breaking through scattered clouds, I dug into the old logs, dusty binders stacked in the back room, records going back to the park's founding in the 30s. Flipping through yellow pages, coffee mugs steaming beside me, I found them. Entries scattered across decades, always on rainy nights. A ranger in 47 noted a whispering transient near Elk Creek, muttering about ancients in the flood, vanished without trace. Another in 62, same deal, figure in the downpour, eyes empty as death, speaking of waters rising with old spirits. 85 had 2 reports, one from my predecessor, describing the exact words, the old ones waiting in the water. No explanations, no follow-ups, just notations faded with time, like the mountains themselves were keeping.
I've been a ranger in the Monongahela National Forest for 12 years now, long enough that most of the trails feel like extensions of my own body. I know where the laurel thickets hide the old moonshine stills, where the copperheads like to sun themselves on the warm rocks in May, which ridges the cell signal dies on. Nights like the one I'm about to tell you about, though, they remind me that no matter how well you think you know these mountains, they still keep rooms you've never been invited into. It was the middle of July, the kind of sticky hot day that makes the air feel thick as sorghum even after the sun drops. A cold front slammed into the warm, wet air hanging over the ridges, and by dusk the sky looked bruised and angry. Thunder started rolling up the valley like artillery, and the rain came down so hard it felt personal. I'd spent the afternoon closing trails and turning hikers around at the Dolly Sides gate. Nobody needed to be up high when the creeks were rising that fast. By 10 o'clock, the worst of it seemed to be passing, so I locked the station and took the old Ford out on patrol. The gravel service road that loops the backside of Roaring Plains was already half river, the truck's tires throwing up sheets of brown water that slapped the undercarriage like hands. I was maybe 6 miles in, headlights cutting twin tunnels through the downpour, when I saw them, footprints. Bare feet, long and narrow, pressed deep into the mud right in the middle of the road. Not walking, running. The stride was stretched out, heel barely touching before the ball of the foot dug in again, like whoever it was had been going flat out. I slowed to a crawl, letting the beams linger. No tire tracks crossing them, no sign of a vehicle stopping. Just those prints appearing out of nowhere and arrowing straight off the left side of the road into a stand of old-growth red spruce that hasn't seen a maintained trail since the CCC left in the 30s. I sat there a minute, wipers beating themselves silly, trying to talk myself out of it. No missing person calls on the radio, no vehicles unaccounted for at the trailheads. Could have been some kid pulling a prank, or a thru hiker who ditched their boots because of blisters and decided to sprint barefoot through a thunderstorm like an idiot. But the depth of the impressions bothered me. Whoever made them weighed enough to sink 4 or 5 inches into saturated clay while moving fast. And something about the spacing felt wrong too frantic, too desperate. Protocol says you don't ignore a fresh sign like that, not when the water's rising. So I killed the engine, pulled on my poncho, and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit like ice water poured straight down my collar. I swung the mag light and followed the prints. They left the road exactly where the shoulder dropped into a shallow ditch, then cut between 2 moss-covered boulders and into the spruce. The canopy closed overhead almost immediately, turning the roar of the rain into a dull, constant hiss, like static on an untuned radio. The beam of my light barely pushed 10 feet ahead. Everything beyond that was black-green and dripping. The footprints stayed clear for the first 100 yards or so, churning the pine needles into black muck. I called out every few steps, standard loud voice, no panic in it yet. "Park service, anybody out here hurt?" Only thunder answered, rolling down off the ridge like it was laughing at me. Then the tracks started to change. The stride shortened, turned sideways, like the person was dodging between trunks. Here and there the left print landed deeper, as if they were favoring the right leg or maybe limping.
I found the first circle about 5 minutes in. The prints looped around a big spruce 3 full times, tight, frantic orbits, heel digs overlapping until the ground looked plowed. After the third loop, they shot off again at a tangent, deeper into the grove. My poncho was snagging on laurel branches now, and every pull sounded too loud in the muffled dark. The air smelled sharp, wet bark, crushed ferns, and something coppery I tried not to think about. I kept following. Couldn't tell you exactly why, except that once you start tracking something in these mountains, stopping feels like surrender. The prints zigzagged more with every passing minute, doubling back on themselves, crossing their own path until I had to slow down to keep from losing them. At one point, they climbed a little rise, then came straight back down the same way, like the runner had seen something and changed his mind fast. I found broken branches at chest height, sap still bleeding, and long scratches in the bark, 4 parallel lines, spaced too wide for any bear I've ever seen. My flashlight picked out smears of mud on the lower trunks, handprints maybe, but too smeared to tell for sure. And then, nothing. The tracks just quit. One final deep impression, toes dug in hard, like the runner had skidded to a stop, and then smooth forest floor. No scuff marks, no sign of a fall, no prints leading away in any direction. I stood there shining the light in slow circles, rain drumming on my hood, trying to make sense of it. The ground was soft enough that even a deer would have left something. I walked widening spirals for 20 minutes, pushing through laurel so thick it ripped a poncho half off me. Nothing. No clothing scraps, no blood, no drag trail. Just that last print and a small clearing no wider than a pickup truck, ringed by spruce so dark it swallowed the light. I don't spook easy. I've found bodies before, swollen and blue after days in the heat or half-eaten by coyotes. And I've tracked men who didn't want to be found. But standing in that clearing, something settled on my shoulders heavier than the rain. The storm felt suddenly quiet, like the forest had drawn a breath and was holding it. I swept the light across the trunks one last time and saw the claw marks again, higher up now, fresh curls of bark hanging like skin. Whatever made them had to been tall, real tall. I backtracked to the truck with my skin crawling the whole way, half expecting to hear running behind me, bare feet slapping wet needles. The radio was nothing but static. The ridges killed a signal when the weather's bad. By the time I got the door slammed and the heater blasting, my hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the mic. I reported it calm as I could. Unknown footprints, possible injured party, tracks terminated without explanation. Dispatch told me to mark the GPS and come in. They'd send a crew at first light if the rain let up. I drove back slow, headlights catching those same prints in the road until the next wave of water washed them smooth. Couldn't sleep when I got to the station. I sat at the desk with coffee going cold and pulled the old incident binders. Started with the maps first. That grove sits in a little dip locals call the Devil's Trinket, a bowl of land where compasses spin lazy circles and the soil's too acidic for much but spruce and moss. Then the reports. The first one I found was from 1953. 2 deer hunters followed bare footprints in fresh snow, same pattern, running hard, circling, gone. 1968, a Boy Scout troop leader reported a camper wandering off during a storm. Footprints found next morning terminated 50 yards from camp. 1987, 1994, 2009, always the same grove, always barefoot, always storming. No bodies ever recovered. One entry, handwritten by a ranger named Henson, who retired the year I started, just said, "Avoid the trinket after dark when the water's high. Some doors only open one way." I've been back plenty of times since that night, daylight mostly. The clearing looks ordinary when the sun's up. Moss, a few fallen logs, raven feathers scattered around like someone's been plucking birds. But when the barometer drops and the clouds stack up black over Canaan Mountain, I find reasons to be somewhere else. I reroute patrols, fudge the logs a little. Cowardly maybe, but I've got a daughter in Morgantown who still needs her dad coming home. Sometimes, driving those gravel roads after a hard rain, I'll catch myself watching the shoulders for fresh prints. Haven't seen any again, not yet. But I know they're out there, waiting for the next storm strong enough to wash the world clean for a minute. And when the thunder starts walking up the valley and the creeks begin to roar, I lock the station door a little earlier than I used to. Because some footprints don't want to be followed. They just want you to see how far someone was willing to run and how quickly the mountain can close its hand.
I've worked alone out of the Little Laurel Patrol cabin for 8 seasons now, ever since they closed the biggest station down at Smoke Hole and spread the rest of us thin across the George Washington National Forest. It's a small place, one room with a wood stove, a cot, a desk, and a shortwave that only catches 2 stations when the weather's good. Most nights I like it that way. The quiet gets inside you after a while, becomes a kind of friend. You learn the difference between the wind worrying the tin roof and something actually moving outside. You learn which floorboard creaks when the temperature drops and which one only sings when weight crosses it. I thought I knew every voice that cabin could make. Last October, the rain came in hard and stayed. Not the gentle soaking kind that brings the morels up in spring, but a cold, straight-down hammering that felt like the sky had decided to empty itself all at once. It started before sunset and never let up. By midnight, the little creek behind the cabin was roaring like a freight train, and the access road had turned into a soup of red clay. I'd already made the call to base, no traffic coming in or out till morning, so I banked the stove, set the battery lantern on low, and tried to read an old Louis L'Amour by the flicker. Sleep wasn't happening. The thunder kept rolling down off North Fork Mountain like it had somewhere to be. Around 2, maybe 2:30, the knocking started. It wasn't loud. 3 taps, pause, 3 more. Polite, almost. The kind of knock you give when you don't want to scare whoever's inside, but you need in bad. I set the book down and listened. The stove popped, the rain hissed on the tin, and then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock, knock. From the front door. I've had hikers show up in storms before, wet, miserable, half lost, so I wasn't alarmed yet, just irritated at the timing. I pulled on my boots, grabbed the kerosene lantern off the nail, and opened the door. Nothing. Just a black night and the rain sheeting sideways, hard enough to sting the skin. The porch boards were awash, water swirling around the legs of the single chair I keep out there. But there were prints, bare feet, long and narrow, pressed deep into the wet wood. They started at the top step and stopped right in front of the door. No prints leading the way. I stepped out, lantern raised, and shouted into the dark, "Hello? You hurt?" The wind took my voice and shredded it. Only the rain answered, drumming on the tin overhang like impatient fingers. I stood there a minute, water running off my hat brim, trying to figure the joke. Kids, maybe, or somebody drunk and turned around. But the prints were fresh, edges still sharp, and the soles had left perfect outlines, high arches, toes splayed like they'd been running hard. I followed them with the light. They crossed the porch, hopped the 2 steps, and cut across the yard toward the old trail that leads to the number 4 outpost, an abandoned cabin the CCC built in '34 and the Forest Service boarded up in the '80s after the roof started caving. 1/4 mile through heavy timber, no reason for anyone to be headed that way in this weather. The knocking came again while I was staring at the tracks, only this time it was fainter, farther off, like someone standing at the far end of that trail doing the same 3 and 3. I should have gone back inside, locked the door, and radioed it in come morning. Instead, I grabbed my slicker, the 12 gauge I keep for problem bears, and started walking. The trail was a creek. Water ran ankle deep in the ruts, carrying pine needles and bits of bark like tiny rafts. My lantern barely pushed the dark back 10 feet. Everything beyond that was a moving wall of rain. Branches slapped my face and dumped cold loads down my collar. The knocking kept on ahead of me, steady, patient. Knock, knock, knock. Knock, knock, knock. It never got louder, never softer, like the person making it was pacing me exactly.
I tried the handheld radio twice, static and distant voices from some tower in Petersburg, nothing useful. 10 minutes of hard walking and the old outpost came into view. A darker shape against the black, roof sagging, windows boarded over with plywood gone silver gray. That stopped me cold. The place had been dark and dead for decades, no wiring, no stovepipe even. Kids sometimes broke in to drink or screw around, but nobody carried lanterns anymore, and nobody would be out here tonight. The knocking was coming from inside now. Same rhythm, only hollower, echoing off the log walls. I eased up to the porch, board spongy, ready to give, and set the lantern down. The light in the window kept moving, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing with a candle held low. I could see shadows on the far wall, tall, thin shapes leaning over something on the table. No voices, no shuffle of feet, just that pacing light and the knock, knock, knock coming from the door I was standing in front of. I told myself it was squatters, nothing more. Raised the shotgun anyway and used the barrel to push the door. It swung inward with a long, wet groan. The knocking stopped the instant the latch cleared. The room was empty, cold as a cave and smelling of wet rot and old smoke. My lantern showed the same things it always did when I checked the place for vandalism. The pot-belly stove rusted open like a mouth, the table scarred with carved initials, mouse nests in the corners. But the floor was soaked, and there were footprints, same bare feet, circling the table, slow and perfect, one after another, like a slow-motion dance. They went round maybe 7, 8 times, and then just quit halfway across the room. No exit prints, no water trailing anywhere else. The candle or whatever had made that light was gone. The room felt used up, like the air itself had been breathed too many times. I stood in the doorway a long time, shotgun lowered but fingers still on the trigger, listening to the rain on the shake roof. The silence after the knocking stopped was worse than the knocking itself. It pressed in, thick as the dark. I swept the lantern across every corner, under the table, even up the cold chimney. Nothing, only those circling prints slowly filling with water from the leaks overhead. I don't know how long I stayed. Long enough for the lantern to burn low and my hands to go numb around the stock. When I finally stepped back outside, the storm had eased to a steady pour. The light I'd seen was gone, the windows black again. I followed my own boot prints back to the trail and didn't look behind me once, though every hair on my neck stayed raised the whole way. Morning came gray and dripping. I radioed it in as possible trespass at Outpost 4. Signs of forced entry, no suspects located. They sent a deputy and another ranger up once the road was passable. We found a circle of prints already blurred, the plywood on one window pried loose and then hammered crudely back. No candle stubs, no food wrappers, no sign anyone had been living there. Just a chill that wouldn't leave the room, even when we opened every board and let the daylight in. I went through the old logbooks that afternoon, the ones nobody's digitized yet. Found 6 entries going back to 1941. Always storm nights, always the same outpost. Rangers hearing knocks, following them, finding wet footprints circling the table and nothing else. One man in 63 wrote that he'd seen people standing around the table, heads down like they were praying, but when he pushed the door, they were gone, and the prints were still wet. He transferred out the next spring. Another entry, 1987, just 2 lines. Heard my dead brother's knock, did not open the door. I sleep in the main station now when the forecast calls for heavy rain. Little Laurel Cabin still has my name on the duty roster, but I keep finding reasons to trade shifts. Some nights when the barometer falls and the clouds sit low on the ridges, I'll hear it anyway. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more, soft like a heartbeat against the window glass. I turn the radio up and keep the lights burning till dawn. Because whatever's out there knocking doesn't always stay at the old outpost. Sometimes it walks the quarter-mile through the timber and stands on my porch, patient as the rain, waiting for me to remember I once opened a door I shouldn't have. And every time the water starts roaring down the hollow, I wonder how many nights I've got left before the knocking finally comes from inside the room I'm in.
I've been walking the trails of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park for 10 years now, long enough that the seasons feel like old friends, and the ridges have names I never put on any map. There's a rhythm to it. Spring wildflowers, summer crowds, fall color, winter quiet, and I've always taken comfort in that steadiness. The mountains don't change much, not really. People do. People come and go, some careful, some careless, and every so often one doesn't come back at all. We search, we grieve, we close the case when there's nothing left to find. That's the job. You learn to live with the ones who stay missing. Last August, we had rain like I've never seen. Not the usual afternoon thunderstorms that roll through and leave the creeks running chocolate, but day after day of low, heavy clouds pressing down on the ridges and dumping water like the sky had torn open. The backcountry trails turned into streams, the low-water bridges disappeared under brown torrents, and the Park Service closed everything west of Newfound Gap. I spent the days posting signs, turning vehicles around, helping families pack out early. By nightfall, I was usually soaked through and bone tired. But the radio kept crackling with updates. Another slide on 441, another ford too deep to cross. On the third straight evening of it, I drew the short straw for a solo patrol down Ramsey Prong, a steep, narrow trail that drops into the Greenbrier area. The map showed 2 footbridges that were likely gone and a couple of backcountry sites that needed checking. Nothing urgent, just routine in bad weather. I started out around dusk, headlights cutting tunnels through the rain as I drove the gravel road to the trailhead. The wipers couldn't keep up. Water sheeted across the windshield in waves. I parked, pulled on my full rain gear, and clipped the big mag light to my belt. The air smelled sharp, wet leaves, mud, and that faint ozone tang you get when the storm's been sitting on you too long. The trail drops fast from the parking lot, switchbacking down through rhododendrons so thick it feels like walking through a tunnel. My boots sank with every step, and the roar of Ramsey Prong filled the ravine below, loud enough that I almost missed the first sound that didn't belong. Laughter. Soft, high-pitched, the kind a child makes when they're delighted with their own daring. It drifted up the trail ahead of me, muffled by the rain but unmistakable. I stopped and listened. Nothing for a few seconds. Then it came again. 3 quick giggles, cut off like someone had clapped a hand over the mouth. No children were registered in the back country that week. We'd cleared every site. I keyed the radio and asked dispatch if any families had slipped past the closure signs. Negative, just me out here. I kept moving, slower now. The laughter came in fits and starts, always ahead, always just far enough that I couldn't pinpoint it. The trail leveled out near the first bridge, or where the bridge used to be. The planks were gone, washed downstream, leaving only the stringers jutting over a torrent the color of coffee with too much milk. Water roared underneath, carrying whole trees like matchsticks. I swept the light across the far side, looking for anyone stranded, but the beam just caught wet rock and dripping leaves. That's when I saw the boat. A little wooden toy, maybe 6 inches long, hand-carved, the kind of thing a grandfather might whittle for a grandchild. It was floating in a puddle right at the trail's edge, bow pointed upstream like it had just been set down and given a gentle push. The paint was faded, red hull, blue stripe, but fresh enough that the rain hadn't yet blurred the colors. I crouched and picked it up, still warm from someone's hand. My stomach did a slow roll. No way a child had been out here, not in this. I tucked the boat in my pocket and stood, shining the light down the trail. The laughter came again, closer now, and definitely moving away from me. I followed. The trail hugs the creek here, narrow and slick, roots slicker than ice under the mud. Every step was a gamble. I called out the usual, "Park Service, anybody need help?" But the words felt thin, swallowed by the roar of water and the steady drum on my hood.
The giggles kept leading me on, sometimes right beside the path, sometimes drifting out over the creek like the child was walking on the water itself. I told myself it was echoes, sound bouncing weird off the wet rocks, but the skin on my neck wouldn't settle. 10 minutes later, I reached the second bridge, or what was left of it. This one had been a single log with a handrail, old but sturdy. The log was still there, half submerged, slick as glass and swaying under the current. On the far bank, maybe 20 feet away, stood a small figure, child-sized, motionless. An old-fashioned coat hung to the knees, dark wool plastered flat by the rain, hood up so I couldn't see the face. Water poured off the hem in steady streams. The figure just stood there, hands at his sides, staring across the flood at me. I raised the light and shouted, "Hey, stay right there, I'm coming over." No response, no wave, no nod, nothing. Just that absolute stillness you don't see in living things very often. Lightning flickered overhead, lighting the ravine white for half a second, and in that flash I saw the face under the hood. Pale, too pale, eyes dark hollows that drink the light instead of reflecting it. The mouth was a small straight line, like a child trying very hard to be good. I stepped onto the log before I could think better of it. The bark was gone, stripped smooth by years of boots and weather, and the water underneath roared loud enough to rattle my teeth. I kept the light on the child, one hand on the useless handrail, moving slow. Halfway across, the laughter started again, but it wasn't joyful anymore. It came from everywhere and nowhere, overlapping, like several children giggling at a joke I wasn't part of. Then it changed. The giggles thinned out, stretched, turned into whispers, soft, urgent, right in my ear, though the figure hadn't moved. Names. Old names. Rangers I'd never met but knew from the memorial plaque at headquarters. Tomlinson, Hayes, McCandless. Each one spoken like a question, like someone reading off a list to see who answers. The last name hit me like cold water down the spine. My training officer, Carl Whitlock, who went through the ice on this same creek 15 years ago when we were searching for a lost hiker. Carl, who taught me how to read water and never trust a crossing in flood stage. His name hung in the air, repeated twice, softer the second time, almost pleading. My foot slipped. The log rolled under my weight, and I went down hard on one knee, pain shooting up my thigh. The flashlight spun out of my hand and vanished into the flood. Darkness swallowed everything but the white froth below. I clawed for balance, caught the handrail splintered years ago, and hauled myself back. When I looked up, the far bank was empty. No child, no coat, no sign anyone had ever stood there. Just the rain and the dark and the creek roaring like it was laughing at me now. I scrambled back the way I'd come, boots sliding, heart hammering so hard I could taste metal. Didn't stop until I reached solid ground on my side. The whispers faded behind me, replaced by the steady roar of water in my own ragged breathing. I sat there a long time, soaked and shaken, staring across at the empty bank until the rain lightened and the first gray of dawn showed through the trees. I didn't argue. That night I pulled the old incident files, the ones nobody digitizes because nobody wants to read them too close. Reports going back to the 30s, rangers hearing children's voices on flooded trails, finding small objects left behind, seeing figures that vanished when approached. Always during heavy rain, always near water. Carl's own report from a year before he died mentioned hearing laughter on this same stretch of Ramsey Prong, wrote it off as imagination. He crossed anyway. They never found his body. I still walk those trails. The park don't close just because one ranger gets spooked. But when the clouds stack up thick and the creeks start to rise, I find reasons to stay high, away from the deep ravines. Some nights, when the rain settles in steady and the wind moves through the hemlocks just right, I'll hear it again, soft laughter drifting up the drainage, calling me down to the water like an old friend who never quite left. I keep the radio close and the volume low because some invitations aren't meant to be answered twice. And every time the water starts whispering those old names, I wonder how long a man can keep walking away before the creek finally claims what it's been asking for all along.
I've spent 21 years patrolling the high balls and deep coves of the Pisgah National Forest, long enough that the smell of damp hemlock and sourwood is as familiar to me as coffee in the morning. Most folks think ranger work is all trail maintenance and telling tourists not to feed the bears. They don't understand how much of it happens after dark, when the gates are locked and the only light is the one you carry yourself. September is usually my favorite month up here. The crowds thin out, the nights cool down, and the leaves start whispering about the color they fixin' to turn. But last September the rain forgot how to stop, and the mountains filled up with fog so thick you could lose the difference between ground and sky. It was a Wednesday, the kind of evening when the clouds sit right on the ridge lines and refuse to budge. Dispatch crackled around 9 with a report from a hiker coming off the Art Lobe. He'd seen a glow deep in the Black Balsam area, orange and steady, where no fire should be. Illegal campfires in wet weather are rare, but they happen, and with everything soaked through, they can still kill you if the wind shifts. I told Base I'd check it, grabbed my pack, and took the service road as far as the gate allowed. After that, it was Shank's mare, headlamp cutting a pale tunnel through the downpour. The trail climbs hard out in the gap, switchbacking up through spruce and fir until you break out onto the balls. The rain was steady, not violent, just patient, like it had all night and meant to use it. Water ran off my hat brim in a constant stream and soaked my cuffs no matter how tight I cinched them. The fog wasn't rolling, it was sitting, thick as wool batting, swallowing sound and distance. My headlamp only pushed it back a few yards before the light scattered and died. Everything beyond that was gray nothing. I felt the watching start about 20 minutes in. You develop a sense for it after enough years alone in the woods. It's not a noise, not a smell. It's a pressure between your shoulder blades, like someone resting 2 fingers there just hard enough to remind you they behind you. I stopped once, turned full circle with the light. Nothing but dripping trunks and the soft hiss of rain on leaves. Told myself it was imagination, the fog playing tricks. Kept walking. It happened again higher up, stronger. This time when I spun the beam caught motion, or thought it did. Something tall sliding sideways between the trees, gone before the light could settle. My pulse kicked, but I kept my breathing even. Could have been a buck, could have been a bear standing upright for a look. Things move strange in fog. I keyed the radio, gave my position, told dispatch I was proceeding to the reported fire. Static answered, thick and wet. The smell reached me before the sight did. Cold smoke, the kind that lingers after rain has murdered the flames. I came out into the little clearing on the south slope of Black Balsam Knob, where the thru-hikers sometimes camp when the shelter's full. The fire pit was there, a neat circle of river stones someone had carried up from Shining Creek years ago. Inside it, embers glowed dull red under a thin skin of ash, still warm enough to hiss when a raindrop found them. No trash, no food bags, no tent, just the stones and the dying fire. Then I saw how the stones were arranged. Not random, not the usual hasty ring. They were laid in a pattern I'd seen once before, carved on a settler's grave market out in Cataloochee. Interlocking crescents and crosses, old Scotch-Irish protection symbols meant to keep something in more than out. The sight of them in that lonely place sent a slow chill down my arms that had nothing to do with the rain. I knelt to take pictures for evidence, the camera's flash strobing white across the wet rocks. That's when the rustle came from the tree line behind me, low and deliberate, like something heavy settling its weight. I stood slow, swinging the headlamp in a slow arc. The fog swallowed the beam whole. Nothing moved that I could see, yet the feeling was stronger now, close enough I could almost taste it. The absolute certainty that I was being studied, the way a man studies a map before he decides which way to walk. I spoke out loud, the way you do when the quiet gets too heavy. Park Service, show yourself.
My voice sounded small, dampened by the mist. No answer except the soft drip of water from branches. I circled the fire ring, looking for boot prints, anything to tell me who'd been here. That's when I found the handprints. They were pressed into the mud just outside the stones, 4 of them in a half moon, facing the fire, like whoever made them had been kneeling there a long time. The prints were too big, fingers too long, the spread from thumb to pinky wider than any man I've ever shaken hands with. I set my own hand beside one for comparison and felt my stomach fold in on itself. My palm looked like a child next to it. I stood up fast, sweeping the light again. The rustle came from a different direction this time, closer, and for just a second the fog parted enough to show me a shape. Tall, thin, shoulders sloping wrong, standing perfectly still between 2 gnarled spruce. The headlamp couldn't find a face, just darkness where a face should be. Then the mist closed again and it was gone. I faced down bears and drunks with knives, and once a fella growing marijuana who met me with a shotgun across his lap. None of it ever turned me around the way that shape did. Something about the stillness of it, the patience. It wasn't hunting me, it was waiting to see what I would do. I backed away from the fire ring, boots slipping on wet grass, keeping the light moving in slow circles. The feeling never left, that pressure on the back of my neck, patient as stone. Every few steps I heard the soft shift of weight in the fog, never close enough to see, always the same distance behind or just off to the side. I walked a mile back to the truck faster than I had come in, not running because running feels like surrender, but not wasting time either. When I reached the gate and slammed the door, the fog outside the windshield looked almost alive, pressing against the glass. I sat there a long time with the engine idling and the heater on full, watching water stream down the windows, trying to slow my heart. The radio finally punched through the static long enough for me to report the fire extinguished, site documented, no contact made. I didn't mention the prints or the shape. Some things you keep off the official log. Next morning the rain had stopped and the fog lifted just enough to let the sun in. I went back with Owens, the seasonal who thinks everything's a Bigfoot story. We found the fire pit cold, the stones kicked apart like someone didn't want them read anymore. Owens laughed it off, said I had spooked myself good. I let him think what he wanted. That afternoon I pulled the oldest log books from the district office basement, the ones with the cracked leather covers and handwriting faded to brown. Took me 3 hours and 2 cups of coffee, but I found them. Reports going back to the 1930s, always in heavy fog, always up high on the balds. Rangers feeling watched, finding fires laid out with the old signs. Describing something tall that stood at the edge of sight and never came closer, never left. One entry from 1943 just said, "It waits to see if you know the way home." The ranger who wrote it transferred to Kansas the next month and never came back east. Because whatever shares these mountains with us has been here a lot longer than the trails or the signs or the uniform I wear. It doesn't speak, it doesn't threaten, it just watches, quiet as mist, to see which of us still remembers how easy it is to walk off the path and never be found. And every time the fog comes down thick enough to lose the world, I wonder how many before me felt those eyes on their back and kept walking anyway, just to know they weren't alone.
I've been stationed at the Cranberry Wilderness District for 14 years now, long enough that the wind through the spruce knows my name and the bears recognize the sound of my truck. November's usually quiet. The leaves are gone, the tourists are gone, and the mountains settle into themselves like an old man pulling a quilt up to his chin. Most nights I just drive the loops, check the gates, make sure no one's foolish enough to be out in weather that can turn on you quick. But some nights the mountains don't settle. Some nights they remember things they'd rather forget. And if you're alone on the ridge when that happens, they'll let you remember with them. It was the 10th of November. Cold rain coming sideways off the plateau, the kind that stings your cheeks and finds every gap in your collar.
I was up on the Middle Ridge Trail, a high open spine that runs between Kennison Mountain and Black Mountain. The soil up there is thin. When it rains hard, the whole slope wants to slide. I've been checking for fresh cracks all evening, marking the bad spots with ribbons so the trail crew would know where to dig come morning. Lightning flickered far off to the west, over Gawley Mountain, close enough to light the clouds purple, but far enough that the thunder took its time getting to me. I was parked at the overlook, engine idling, heater on low, sipping coffee gone cold hours ago, when I saw the lights. At first, I thought they were reflections, headlights from the valley road bouncing off wet laurel, but the valley was miles below and empty this late. These were up high with me, maybe 200 feet lower, drifting just above the treetops on the north slope. Pale yellow, soft as candle flames, moving slow against the wind. Not swaying like something hanging, dancing. Back and forth, weaving in and out of each other the way kids do when they playing tag and nobody wants to be it. I've seen plenty of weird light in these mountains, swamp gas, distant house windows, drunk hunters with lasers, but nothing that moved like that in the gale. I grabbed a binoculars. The rain on the windshield blurred everything, so I rolled the window down and let the cold soak my shoulder. Through the lenses, the light sharpened, a dozen, maybe more, perfectly round, no bigger than softballs, floating in a loose figure eight that kept tightening and loosening like a heartbeat. Every now and then one would dip below the canopy and vanish, then pop back up somewhere else. No rhyme I could follow, yet it felt deliberate, like a conversation I wasn't part of. My first thought was distress, hikers with those cheap glowing bracelets maybe, trying to signal. My second thought was poachers using some newfangled lure I hadn't seen yet. Either way, I couldn't sit there and do nothing. I radioed base, gave my position, said I was investigating possible signaling on the north slope. Static answered, thick and wet, the way it always gets when the storm sits right on top of you. I tried twice more, then gave up. If somebody was hurt, minutes mattered. I left the truck running with the flashes on and started down. The slope is steep there, 40 degrees in places, all loose rock and mountain laurel that grabs your ankles like it's got opinions. I took the old footpath that switchbacks through the rhododendron, boots sliding on wet leaves, one hand on saplings to keep from pitching forward. The rain never let up. It hammered the hood of my slicker so hard I could barely hear myself think. My headlamp cut a narrow cone, and the fog swallowed everything outside it. Every few steps I stopped to look for the lights. They were still there, lower now, pacing me. When I moved, they moved. When I stopped, they hovered, pulsing gently like they were breathing. Halfway down, I crossed an old skid trail the loggers used in the 30s. The lights dipped below the treetops and disappeared. For a minute, I thought that was it. Whatever trick of weather or reflection I'd been chasing had burned itself out. Then they rose again, brighter, closer together, directly ahead. The pull I felt then wasn't rational. It was a tug behind the sternum, gentle but certain, the same feeling you get when you hear your name called from another room and you know you have to answer. I told myself it was duty, nothing more, and kept walking. The ground leveled into a little bench, a pocket meadow no bigger than a house lot, ringed by spruce gone twisted and black with age. The grass was beaten flat by weeks of rain, and in the middle of it the lights hung motionless, 6 or 7 feet off the ground. Up close they weren't yellow anymore. They were the color of old bone left out in the weather, soft and depthless. No heat came off them, no crackle, no insect hum, nothing. Just silence and that steady pulse, in and out, like something waiting for the right heartbeat to match. I stepped into the clearing and the lights spread apart, forming a loose circle around me. Not threatening, not yet, curious. The rain kept falling, but inside the circle it felt muffled, like the air itself had thickened. I swept the headlamp across them and saw my own shadow stretched huge against the trees, broken into pieces by the glow. Then the voices started. Not loud, never loud, just threads of sound carried on the wind, pieces of conversations I had no business hearing. A woman calling a name, Tommy, over and over, voice cracking the way it does when hope is running out. A man farther off, hoarse, pleading for someone to go back and get his brother. And underneath it all, younger voices, children maybe, laughing the way kids do when they've wandered too far and still think it's a game. I've seen plenty of weird light in these mountains, swamp gas, distant house windows, drunk hunters with lasers, but nothing that moved like that in a gale. I grabbed the binoculars. The rain on the windshield blurred everything, so I rolled the window down and let the cold soak my shoulder. Through the lenses, the light sharpened. A dozen, maybe more, perfectly round, no bigger than softballs, floating in a loose figure eight that kept tightening and loosening like a heartbeat. Every now and then one would dip below the canopy and vanish, then pop back up somewhere else. No rhyme I could follow, yet it felt deliberate, like a conversation I wasn't part of. My first thought was distress, hikers with those cheap glowing bracelets maybe trying to signal. My second thought was poachers using some newfangled lure I hadn't seen yet. Either way, I couldn't sit there and do nothing. I radioed base, gave my position, said I was investigating possible signaling on the north slope. Static answered, thick and wet, the way it always gets when the storm sits right on top of you. I tried twice more, then gave up. If somebody was hurt, minutes mattered. I left the truck running with the flashes on and started down. The slope is steep there, 40 degrees in places, all loose rock and mountain laurel that grabs your ankles like it's got opinions. I took the old footpath that switchbacks through the rhododendron, boots sliding on wet leaves, one hand on saplings to keep from pitching forward. The rain never let up. It hammered the hood of my slicker so hard I could barely hear myself think. My headlamp cut a narrow cone, and the fog swallowed everything outside it. Every few steps I stopped to look for the lights. They were still there, lower now, pacing me. When I moved, they moved. When I stopped, they hovered, pulsing gently like they were breathing. Halfway down, I crossed an old skid trail the loggers used in the 30s. The lights dipped below the treetops and disappeared. For a minute, I thought that was it. Whatever trick of weather or reflection I'd been chasing had burned itself out. Then they rose again, brighter, closer together, directly ahead. The pull I felt then wasn't rational. It was a tug behind the sternum, gentle but certain, the same feeling you get when you hear your name called from another room and you know you have to answer. I told myself it was duty, nothing more, and kept walking. The ground leveled into a little bench, a pocket meadow no bigger than a house lot, ringed by spruce gone twisted and black with age. The grass was beaten flat by weeks of rain, and in the middle of it the lights hung motionless, 6 or 7 feet off the ground. Up close they weren't yellow anymore. They were the color of old bone left out in the weather, soft and depthless. No heat came off them, no crackle, no insect hum, nothing. Just silence and that steady pulse, in and out, like something waiting for the right heartbeat to match. I stepped into the clearing and the lights spread apart, forming a loose circle around me. Not yet, not yet. Curious. The rain kept falling, but inside the circle it felt muffled, like the air itself had thickened. I swept the headlamp across them and saw my own shadows stretched huge against the trees, broken into pieces by the glow. Then the voices started. Not loud, never loud. Just threads of sound carried on the wind, pieces of conversations I had no business hearing. A woman calling a name, Tommy, over and over, voice cracking the way it does when hope is running out. A man farther off, hoarse, pleading for someone to go back and get his brother. And underneath it all, younger voices, children maybe, laughing the way kids do when they've wandered too far and still think it's a game. I recognized one of the pleas, word for word. It was from the search log of '87, a hiker named Daniel Grayson who walked off the trail up here one October afternoon and was never seen again. I'd read his girlfriend's statement a dozen times. The way she said his name was unmistakable. The lights pulsed brighter when the voices rose, dimmed when they faded. I felt that tug again, stronger, urging me toward the far side of the clearing, where the ground dropped away into a tangle of blowdowns and darkness. 1 step and I'd be out of the circle. 2 steps and I'd be following the same path those voices had taken years ago. My boots moved before I told them to, just one small shuffle forward, then another. The air smelled like wet leaves and something older, like a house shut up too long. I don't know what.
I've been a ranger in the Monongahela National Forest for going on 18 years, mostly working the backcountry around Snowshoe and Cass. The job's changed a lot since I started. More tourists with their fancy gear, fewer old-timers who know the land like their own skin. But the mountains stay the same. Deep hollows that swallow light, ridges sharp as knife blades, and weather that can turn a good day sour in minutes. April's always tricky. The ground thaws but stays soft, creeks swell with snowmelt, and the rain comes like it's got a grudge. Most folks stay off the trails then, but I'm out there anyway, checking for washouts, marking slides, making sure the bridges hold. It's solitary work, the kind that either breaks you or settles deep in your bones. For me, it's mostly the latter. Until that night last April, when the rain brought something back that should have stayed buried. It started like any late shift. I'd finished up at the station around dusk, logging a report on a family who'd gotten stuck at the Cranberry Glades boardwalk after the water rose. The sky was already low and heavy, clouds the color of wet slate pressing down on the ridges. By the time I headed out, the rain was steady, not pounding yet, but promising to. I took the old Jeep up the gravel road toward the Highland Scenic Highway, then parked at the pull-off for the cemetery trail. It's not much of a trail, just a faint path locals call the graveyard walk, leading to an old family plot from the 1800s. Settlers who came over the mountains looking for timber and coal buried their dead up there on a flat bench of land where the wind couldn't steal them. We keep it maintained for history's sake, but hardly anyone visits anymore. No vandalism reports, no missing persons, just routine to check after heavy rain, make sure the ground hadn't slumped and exposed anything. The rain was coming down harder by then, drumming on my hat and turning the path into a slick ribbon of mud. I flicked on my headlamp, the beam cutting through the dark like a knife through fog. The trail climbs gentle at first, winding through hemlock and rhododendron, the branches hanging low and dripping. Every step sucked at my boots, and the air smelled thick, wet earth, pine sap, and that faint rot that comes when leaves have been buried too long. I moved slow, sweeping the light ahead, looking for fresh erosion or fallen limbs blocking the way. The thunder was distant at first, rolling like wagons over the next ridge, but it was getting closer, the kind that makes your chest vibrate. About halfway up, maybe a quarter mile in, my boots sank deeper than it should have. Not just mud, something solid giving way under my weight. I pulled back quick, heart kicking a little, and shone the light down. The ground had softened into a shallow dip, maybe 6 inches deep, and there in the center was a stone. Small, no bigger than a dinner plate, half buried in the muck, but freshly disturbed, like someone had pried it loose and left it for the rain to wash clean. No marker like that should have been there. The cemetery was another 100 yards up. I knelt careful, ignoring the water soaking through my knees, and brushed away the dirt with gloved fingers. The stone was rough, field granite probably, and under the mud were carvings, faint, weathered letters spelling out names from another time. Ezekiel Harlan, B. 1823, D. 1847, beloved son. Below it, smaller, Mary Harlan, his sister, taken same day. I sat back on my heels, the rain pattering on my back. Harlan, that name rang a bell from old station stories. Folks who died in a flash flood back in the 1800s, bodies never recovered proper. But this stone wasn't in any of our records, and it looked like it had been dug up recent, edges sharp where they should have been smoothed by years underground. I should have marked it, radioed it in, and left it for the historians come morning, but curiosity got me, that quiet pull you feel when the mountains show you something they've kept hidden. I stood and kept going up the trail, the stone tucked in my pack for safekeeping. The thunder was closer now, lightning flickering through the trees like distant lanterns.
The path leveled out into the cemetery clearing, maybe a dozen headstones leaning crooked in the grass, names worn to whispers by time and weather. The rain made everything slick and black, water pooling in the sunken spots where coffins had long since rotted away. That's when I heard it, the sobbing. Soft at first, almost lost in the downpour, but human no doubt. A low, keening sound, like someone grieving quiet so as not to wake the dead. It came from the far side of the clearing, near the oldest stones clustered under a big oak. I froze, headlamp sweeping slow. "Hello? Anyone out here?" My voice sounded flat, swallowed by the storm. No answer, just that sobbing rising and falling with the wind. It tugged at me, that sound, reminded me of my own mama at my daddy's funeral, holding it all in until she couldn't anymore. I moved toward it careful, boots squelching, one hand on my flashlight, the other near the radio. The thunder rumbled again, closer, and the air felt heavier, like the rain was pressing everything down. There, between two tilted markers, stood a figure. Bent low, shoulders hunched under drenched rags that might have been a coat once, hood pulled forward hiding the face. They were rocking slow, hands clasped in front like in prayer, the sobbing coming from deep in their chest. My first thought was a hiker caught out, maybe someone local paying respects in the storm. "Hey, you all right? This weather's no good for being out." I kept my tone calm, steady, the way you talk to a spooked animal. The figure didn't look up, just kept rocking, the sobs hitching with each breath. I stepped closer, maybe 10 feet away now, rain streaming off my face. Lightning cracked overhead, lightening the clearing white for a split second, and that's when I saw clear. The figure straightened slow, like an old hinge creaking, and turned toward me. The face under that hood was gaunt, skin stretched tight over bones sharp as winter branches, cheeks hollow deep, eyes sunken in shadows, dark pits that caught no light, staring at me with a sorrow so heavy it made my chest ache. Lips thin and cracked, moving silent at first, then murmuring words I could barely hear over the thunder. "Disturbed rest. You shouldn't have. They need their rest." My skin went cold, colder than the rain could make it. I raised the light higher, trying to see more, but the figure just pointed one long, trembling finger at the ground near my feet. There, half sunk in the mud, was the stone I'd found, the Harlan marker, placed neat between the graves like it belonged. But I'd had it in my pack. I reached back quick, empty. The figure's voice grew stronger, a whisper that cut through the storm like a knife. "Disturbed rest. Bring it back. Let them sleep." Then another flash of lightning, brighter, and the figure was gone. No sound of footsteps, no rustle in the brush, just empty air and the rain pouring down. I don't remember the walk back to the Jeep, legs moving on their own, mind stuck on that face, those eyes like wells of old grief. For morning came gray and dripping, the storm spent. I drove up with my supervisor and a couple maintenance guys. The cemetery looked ordinary in daylight, stones leaning, grass flattened by rain, no sign of disturbance. We reburied the Harlan marker right where I'd found it the night before, tamped the earth firm and marked it for the Historical Society. They laughed it off as me getting turned around in the dark, maybe hearing my own echoes. I let them think that. But that afternoon, I pulled the old journals from the station safe, the leather-bound ones from rangers long gone. Flipping through yellowed pages, I found them, entries scattered over decades, always on rainy nights in April. Rangers hearing sobs in the old cemeteries, seeing bent figures among the stones, always pointing to disturbed graves, always murmuring about rest. One from 1962, figure appeared after I righted a fallen stone, face like famine, eyes empty, vanished when I blinked, felt the sorrow in my bones after. Another, 1948, guardian of the forgotten they call it, pulls at the veil on wet nights, left me with dreams of names I never knew. I've patrolled that trail plenty since, marking it on my rounds when the forecast calls for rain. But now, every rain-soaked stone looks different, like it's waiting to be uncovered, like it holds a name that might be mine someday. The sorrow clings quiet, a weight in my chest that makes the mountains feel smaller, more crowded with the past. Some nights, when the thunder rolls low and the rain taps steady on my roof, I'll hear that sobbing again, faint through the walls, calling me back to the graves. I keep the lights on and the radio low, but I wonder how long before I answer, before I kneel in the mud and let the forgotten show me what rest really means. Because out here, the dead don't stay quiet forever, and every storm brings a little more of them back.
I've worked the Linville Gorge District for 16 seasons now, long enough that the roar of the river at the bottom of the canyon feels like a second heartbeat. June is when the rhododendron bloom blood red along the cliffs and the tourists come in droves. But once the sun drops behind Table Rock, the gorge empties fast. People sense, even if they don't admit it, that the place doesn't belong to the living after dark. The river takes what it wants down there, always has. We pull bodies out most years, sometimes one, sometimes more. The water gives them back bloated and pale, eyes eaten by crawfish, but it gives them back, except when it doesn't. That night, the rain started before supper and never let up. A slow, soaking deluge that turned every side creek into a torrent and made the main river sound like a freight train running loose. I'd spent the afternoon closing trails and turning cars around at the gorge rim. By 10 o'clock, the access road was awash, and the only way in or out was on foot. Dispatch told me to bed down at the cabin on Short Off, but the river gauge at the lower bridge was climbing faster than I liked, so I grabbed my slicker and headlamp and started down the Mountains to Sea Trail to check the erosion along the lower stretches. Just routine, just doing the job. The trail drops hard off Short Off, switchbacking through laurel hails so thick you can't see 10 feet in daylight, let alone a downpour. Water ran ankle deep in the ruts, carrying pine needles and chunks of bark like tiny rafts. My headlamp cut a weak tunnel. Everything outside it was black and moving. The roar of the river rose to meet me long before I could see it, a steady, hungry growl that rattled my teeth. I reached the river path around midnight, where the trail runs 20 feet above the water on a narrow bench of land. Normally, the Linville is clear and cold down there, green as bottle glass. That night, it was the color of coffee with a little milk, rolling high against the banks, chewing at roots and boulders like it had a grudge. I was shining the light along the toe of the slope, looking for fresh slumps, when I saw the first shadow move under the surface. It was long, longer than any man has a right to be, pale against the brown water, gliding upstream against a current that would have swept a kayak away like a leaf. I stopped dead, thinking log, thinking debris, thinking anything but what my eyes were telling me. Then another joined it, and another, moving in a loose line the way fish school, only these weren't fish. They kept pace with me along the bank, just under the skin of the river, rising and falling with the waves, but never breaking clear. I swept the light across the water, and the shapes scattered for a second, then regrouped, closer now, matching every step I took. I told myself it was refraction, raindrops on the lens, exhaustion. Kept walking, told myself a lot of things. The splashing started upstream, soft at first, like someone wading careful. I turned the beam that way and caught a flash of white, an arm maybe, or what used to be an arm, rising straight up out of the flood before sliding back under. No splash when it went down, just a smooth practice motion, like something that had done it 1,000 times. Another followed, then another, pale limbs breaking the surface and vanishing, always upstream, always just out of reach. The hair on my neck stood up so hard it hurt. I've seen bodies in that river. I know what drowned skin looks like after days in the water, gray-blue, swollen, peaceful in a horrible way. These weren't bloated. They were thin, stretched, moving with purpose. I stepped closer to the edge, boots sinking in the mud, and shone the light straight down.
For a second, the beam caught a face looking up at me. Eyes wide and milk white, mouth open in a perfect O, hair floating like black seaweed. Then it rolled under and was gone. I backed up fast, slipped, went down hard on one knee. When I scrambled up, there were handprints on the bank right where I'd been standing. Long fingers, too many joints, pressed deep into the mud and already filling with water. The prints dragged away from the river, toward the woods, a trail of them leading into the laurel thicket like something had crawled out and decided to walk on land for a change. I've never been one to run from much. Bears don't scare me, drunks with knives don't scare me, but that trail of prints did. Still, the job is the job. I followed. The prints went maybe 50 yards, weaving between trunks, getting shallower as the ground rose. They ended at a little cove where the river bends sharp and the water backs up into a black pool. The surface there was bubbling, slow, steady breaths rising from below, as if the pool itself was alive and breathing through its nose. I stood at the edge, light shaking in my hand, and the shapes came together under the water. 4, maybe 5 of them, circling lazy, waiting. One rose until its back broke the surface, pale and ridged like a spine that had forgotten how many bones it was supposed to have. It didn't turn, didn't look, just floated there, patient. Then the groaning started. Low, almost under the threshold of hearing, vibrating up through the ground and into my boots. Not pain, not exactly, more like a sigh that had been held for 100 years and was finally letting go. The sound carried names with it, woven into the groan like threads and cloth. Names I knew from the memorial board at headquarters, from old search reports I typed up myself. Ellison, 1948, Whitmore, 1972, Greer, 1999. Each one drawn out slow, tasting the air. My own last name brushed past my ear soft as a kiss, and that's when I turned and walked away. Not ran, walked, fast. I felt them follow for a little while, a cold patch moving just under the surface, keeping pace along the bank. The groaning faded behind me, replaced by the steady roar of the river, but the chill stayed between my shoulder blades all the way back to the trail. When I risked a look, the water was empty again, brown and wild and innocent. Morning came dull and gray. The river had dropped a foot overnight, leaving fresh debris lines high on the banks. I went back with Martinez and the dog. We found the handprints already washed smooth, the cove quiet, nothing but frogs and dragonflies. Martinez joked about too much coffee and not enough sleep. I laughed along. That night, I pulled the oldest files we have, the ones handwritten in pencil on paper gone soft as cloth. Reports from the 30s, 40s, 50s, always June floods, always shapes in the water when the river ran brown. Rangers calling them the taken, the unreturned, creek dwellers. One entry from 1953 was just 3 lines. They rose tonight, spoke my brother's name. He went in 49. I will not patrol the lower gorge alone again. I still patrol the lower gorge. Somebody has to. But when the rain sets in hard and the river starts to rise, I keep to the high trails. Some nights I'll be driving the rim road and feel the truck dip, like something heavy just climbed into the bed and then thought better of it. I never stop to check. And every time the water turns that certain shade of brown and the thunder walks the ridge, I hear that groan again, patient as stone, tasting names it hasn't finished with yet. The river always gives bodies back, they say, unless it decides it wants to keep one a little longer. And on the nights when the rain won't stop and the current runs hungry, I wonder whose name it's practicing next.
I've been the Lone Ranger out of the Laurel Fork Station in the Dolly Sides Wilderness for 9 years now, long enough that the wind through the spruce knows my step, and the ravens quit bothering to fly when they hear the truck. May is usually gentle up there. The red spruce buds are soft green, the bogs smell like tea, and the tourists haven't arrived in force yet. But when the weather turns, it turns quick.
A warm front can slam into the plateau and sit for days, dumping rain that finds every seam in your slicker and every crack in your nerves. That night in May, the rain didn't come down so much as it hung in the air, thick as creek fog, turning the world into a wet gray curtain. I was finishing the evening loop, headlights cutting tunnels through the downpour on the Forest Service road that dead ends at the Red Creek campground. The place is remote even by sod standards. No cell service, no power, just a handful of primitive sites scattered along the river. Most folks avoid it when the forecast is bad, but every season, someone thinks they're tougher than the mountain. Around 11, the radio had crackled with a weak call from a camper saying they were packing out early because the creek was rising. The signal died before I could answer, and I hadn't seen headlights on the road, so I figured I'd better check. The campground was empty except for one tent pitched crooked at site number 4, the farthest from the vault toilet and closest to the thickest laurel. It was a cheap dome tent, the kind college kids buy at Walmart, sagging under the weight of water, guy lines loose, door flaps flapping like a broken jaw. No vehicle at the pull-in, no lantern glow, just the rain drumming on nylon and the creek roaring 50 yards away, already out of its banks. I parked, left the truck idling with the high beams on, and walked over. The mud sucked at my boots with every step. I called out the usual, "Park service, anybody home?" Only the rain answered. I shone the mag light inside. Gear was strewn everywhere, sleeping bags half out of their stuff sacks, a stove tipped on its side, food wrappers floating in an inch of water that had pooled on the floor. 2 backpacks, both unzipped and emptied like someone had searched them in a hurry. And in the middle of it all, a spiral notebook lying open, pages bloated, but the ink still dark. The last entry was scrawled in capital letters that shook off the page. They're still out there. Eyes in the dark. They watch and wait, and when you look away, they move. Don't follow the circle. I stood there longer than I should have, rain dripping off my hat brim onto the paper. No missing person call, no vehicle, no footprints leading the way that I could see. Just the tent and the warning and the creek getting louder by the minute. I started securing the site the way we do, zipped the flaps, weighted the corners with rocks so the wind wouldn't scatter everything to Tennessee. That's when the rustling began. It was soft at first, just the normal sound of wet leaves brushing together. Then it changed. Branches parted on the far side of the clearing, deliberate, like something pushing through instead of the wind doing it. I swung the light that way, and the rustling stopped dead. Silence fell so complete, I could hear individual drops hitting the tent. I called again, louder. "This is the ranger. Show yourself." Nothing. Then, from the opposite side, the same slow part in the laurel, closer. Again the light hit it, and again everything froze. I've heard bears circle camps before, curious or after food, but bears don't stop when you shine a light. Bears don't move in perfect silence. Whatever was out there was pacing the clearing, slow and patient, keeping just outside the reach of my beam. I felt it more than saw it, the sense of being studied, weighed, like livestock before the gate opens. I stepped away from the tent to get a better angle, and that's when the mimicking started. My own voice came back at me from the dark, thin and distorted, the way sound gets when it travels through heavy rain and thick leaves. "This is the ranger," it said, trailing off into a wet laugh that wasn't mine. I froze. The words came again, from a different direction, lower this time, almost amused. "Show yourself." Then quieter, almost a whisper riding the wind. "Don't follow the circle." My skin went cold under the slicker. I swept the light in slow arcs, trying to catch movement, but the laurel was too thick and the rain too hard. The rustling picked up again, faster now, a steady circuit around the clearing, never breaking cover, never letting me see more than a branch swaying after whatever passed. I backed toward the tent, hand on the bear spray, and that's when I noticed the scratches. They were on the rain fly, 4 parallel lines raked deep through the nylon, too straight and evenly spaced for claws, too deliberate for accident. The cut started at the peak and ran downward, like something tall had dragged its fingers across the fabric while standing perfectly still. I ran the light along the ground and found the footprints, bare, narrow, splayed wide at the toes, leading away from the tent into the laurel, and then just stopping. No scuff, no deeper impression, no sign of turning, just gone, like the ground had swallowed them mid-step. The rain kicked up harder, a sudden roar like someone turned a faucet. The rustling tightened, closer, and the mimicking came from everywhere at once, overlapping, my own voice braided with others I didn't recognize, all saying the same words, softer and softer. I felt the circle close, the pressure of unseen eyes pressing in from every side. It wasn't panic, not yet, but something older, the feeling you get when you realize the game has rules you were never told. I did the only thing I could think of. I walked straight back to the truck, slow, no running, never turning my back on the dark. The rustling kept pace the whole way, branches parting and closing like a slow heartbeat. When I reached the clearance edge, it stopped all at once. Silence again, heavier than before. I climbed in, locked the doors out of habit more than sense, and sat there with the engine running and the wipers slapping, staring at the tent and the headlights. The flaps hung open again, though I'd zipped them shut minutes earlier. I drove out slow, headlights cutting tunnels through the rain, half expecting to see shapes in the rear view keeping pace along the tree line. Nothing showed. By the time I reached the station, the storm had eased to a steady patter, and the creek had dropped enough to cross. I filed a report as abandoned campsite, gear secured, no occupants located. Left out the scratches, the footprints, the voices. Some things don't belong on paper. Next morning, I went back with 2 seasonals and a dog. The tent was exactly as I'd left it, but every zipper was open wide, and the journal was gone. The scratches on the nylon looked softer in daylight, almost like wear patterns, easy to explain away. The footprints had washed out completely. We packed the gear, held it to storage, closed the case. No vehicle ever turned up, no missing person report ever matched, just 2 kids who vanished between one breath and the next. That was 3 seasons ago. I still patrol Red Creek alone when the schedule demands it. But when the clouds stack low and the rain settles in for the night, I keep the truck windows up and the music louder than I used to. Some nights I'll catch a rustle in a laurel that matches my pace exactly, or hear my own voice drifting back from the dark a half second too late. I never answer. I never stop. Because whatever circles those campsites in the rain isn't hunting for food. It's hurting. Patient as the mountains themselves, walking you one slow step at a time toward the place where footprints stop and the circle finally closes. And every time the storm moves in and the laurel starts to breathe, I wonder how many nights I have left before I'm the one who don't drive out come morning.
I've walked the ridges of the New River Gorge for 23 years now, long enough that the cold tips and slate dumps feel like old neighbors, and the river down below has taken on the color of strong tea from 100 years of runoff. October is when the leaves turn the color of dried blood and the air smells like wood smoke and wet rock. Tourists come for the bridge and the views, but they rarely stray far from the pavement. The backcountry belongs to the mines, and the mines belong to what's left inside them. We seal them when they get dangerous. Post signs, string tape, move on. Most nights the mountains let you do your job. Some nights they don't. That evening, the rain came in sideways off the plateau, cold and hard, the kind that finds every rip in your slicker and soaks you to the bone in minutes. Dispatch had called around dusk. A hiker reported fresh collapse at the old Kmore No. 3 shaft, the one perched halfway down the cliff above the river. The entrance had been boarded since the 80s, but wet weather always loosens things that want to stay buried. I loaded chain, boards, a come-along, and the big battery lantern into the truck and drove the service road as far as it would take me.
After that, it was boots and mud and the long scramble down the slope to the mine bench. The trail down was a mess, water running in sheets, turning the path into a staircase of slick roots and loose shale. My headlamp cut a narrow cone, everything else was black and roaring. The river sounded close enough to touch, though it was 300 feet straight down. I could smell coal dust and wet leaves and something sharper underneath, like struck matches. When I reached the bench, the shaft mouth gaped open like a wound, timber splintered, caution tape flapping loose in the wind. Someone or something had torn the old plywood right off the hinges. I set the lantern on a rock and started stringing new boards, working quick because the rain was only getting harder. That's when I heard the first whisper. It came from inside the shaft, soft as breath on glass. Just a thread of sound under the drumming rain, almost lost. I stopped hammering and listened. Nothing for a long second. Then it came again, two voices overlapping, thin and papery. Light, bring light. I shone the headlamp into the darkness. The beam died 10 feet in, swallowed by wet black. The air coming out was colder than the rain, carrying that smell again, damp earth and old blood, the scent of a butcher shop left closed too long. I told myself it was wind moving through the tunnels, the way it sighs in old workings when the barometer drops. I've heard it before, voices that aren't voices, names that sound like yours until you realize they're just air pushing over broken rock. I went back to nailing boards. The whispers kept on, patient, rising and falling with the gusts. Then the words sharpened, like someone had turned up the volume one careful notch. Ellis, 1914. Tompkins, 1907. Bring us light. I knew those names. They're carved on the memorial down in Nuttleburg, the ones who never came up after the explosions. I stood there with the hammer hanging loose in my hand, rain dripping off the brim of my hat, and felt the years peel away. The whispers weren't coming from the wind anymore. They were coming from people, dozens of them, layered like choir voices in a church you can't see. I should have finished the boards and walked away. Instead, I picked up the lantern and stepped closer. The entrance was tall enough to walk in upright, timber sagging but still holding. Water dripped from the ceiling in steady beats, plinking in the black puddles that reflected nothing. 10 feet in, the tunnel bent left, disappearing into absolute dark. The whispers grew clearer with every step, a roll call that never hurried. Caldwell, 1923. Lawhorn, 1898. Names from disasters I'd studied when I first got stationed here. Men who'd been trapped behind cave-ins, burned, drowned when the pumps failed. The air coiled at me, gentle but steady, like a hand on my sleeve. I raised the lantern. The light touched the walls and the shadows moved wrong. Not the clean jump of a beam on rock, but slow, stretching shapes that leaned away from the glow and then leaned back when I turned. Figures, tall and thin, pressed against the timbers just outside the circle of light. I couldn't see faces, only the suggestion of shoulders, heads tilted, like they were listening for my footsteps. One of them shifted closer, and for a heartbeat the lantern showed me a hand pressed against the wall, palm open, fingers too long, skin the color of old ash. The smell hit harder then, coal dust and wet stone, and that copper tang that never quite leaves the air after violence. The whispers changed, no longer just names. Now they were pleading, soft and desperate. Don't leave us, just a little light. We've waited so long. My chest tightened like someone had cinched a belt around it. I felt the pull stronger, a physical thing, urging me deeper where the tunnel narrows and the ceiling sagged low to brush my hat. I took one step past the bend. The lantern flickered, though the battery was fresh. In that stutter of light, I saw them clearly for the first time. Men in ragged overalls, faces blackened with coal dust, eyes pale and wide, mouths moving in perfect silence, while the whispers came from everywhere and nowhere. They didn't walk so much as drift, feet inches above the ground, reaching with hands that ended in broken fingers. The nearest one tilted his head and spoke my father's name, the way he used to call me in from chores when I was small. My father, who went into a mine in '89 and never came out either. I backed up fast, boots slipping on the wet floor. The lantern swung wild and the shadows lunged, stretching across the timbers like they meant to grab hold. The whispers turned frantic, overlapping, a rising tide of voices begging me not to go. Stay, just a little longer, light for the dark. The cold wrapped around my throat. I felt the pull stronger, a physical thing, urging me deeper where the tunnel narrows and the ceiling sagged low to brush my hat. I turned and walked, didn't run, because running in a mine is how you die quick. The voices followed all the way to the entrance, rising to a soft wail that cut off the instant I crossed the threshold. I slammed the new boards across the opening, nailed them blind, hands shaking so hard I bent half the nails. When I stepped back, the rain had washed the world clean, and the only sound was water dripping from the cliffs and the river far below. Morning came gray and quiet. I went back with the maintenance crew and a generator. The boards were still in place, nails straight, no sign they'd been touched. Inside, the first 20 feet was empty, just wet rock and silence. No footprints but 9, no handprints on the walls. We poured concrete and steel over the entrance and called it sealed for good. That night, I pulled up the old logbooks, the ones nobody reads anymore. Found entries going back to the 1930s, always October rains, always K-Moore number 3. Rangers hearing voices, names of the lost, pleas for light. One man in 1957 wrote that he saw his own brother beckoning from the dark, the same brother killed in the '49 explosion. He transferred to Shenandoah the next spring and never came back to coal country. Another entry, 1974, just 4 words. They almost had me. I still patrol the gorge. Someone has to. But when the barometer drops and the rain settles in hard, I stay high on the rim where the mines can't reach. Some nights I'll be driving the service road and feel the truck slow, like the air itself is thicker, and I'll smell coal dust though the windows are closed tight. I never stop. I never shine the light down the old access trails, because the dead down there are patient. They've got nothing but time and darkness, and every big rain softens the ground a little more. One of these storms the seals will give, or someone curious or pry the boards loose, or I'll be the one who walks too close when the voices call a name I can't ignore. And when that night comes, I know exactly whose light they'll be waiting for.